Dr. Thomas Hübl is a renowned teacher, author, and international facilitator who works within the complexity of systems and cultural change by integrating modern science with the insights of humanity's wisdom traditions. He is the author of Healing Collective Trauma, a book that greatly impacted me, and his latest book, Attuned. He's here to have a chat with me about that now. So, like I was sharing with you, Thomas, before we hit record and got started, I've been such a fan of your work for so long. So, having this opportunity not only to be able to take a sneak peek of your newest book, Attuned, but also now to have you in conversation, I'm just so very grateful for. So, thank you for sharing your gifts, your mind with the world. It is truly life-changing. And thank you in particular for sharing it with me and my community right now.
So happy to be here with you. It's lovely. So I'm curious about our conversation.
Yes, so I'm super excited, and I think a grateful place to start. And I'm a quote person, so those of you who've listened to my interviews before know I often love to pluck quotes because I just find words so beautiful, and your words in particular, the way you capture so many of these concepts, I was really struck by. So I want to start off with a quote and then dive us into a conversation. And I think quite at the beginning of your new book called Attuned, you say, in the most fundamental sense, healing is simply the creation of the right container or environment, one of attunement or synchronization, which is the very language of relating. I have chills as I'm reading that aloud, affirming, I think, the universal reality of that. But starting us off with that quote in hopes, because here we already meet this word attunement, and your book, of course, is similarly called Attuned. What is it that you mean? What does attunement mean? What does it mean to be attuned? And what inspired you then to dedicate an entire book and the title of the book to that concept?
Okay, so let's say when I sit here with you and I feel you when you share and when you read your quote, the quote that you read, then immediately my body and my nervous system start to get a sense of you. I feel connected to you. That's already attunement, which I think for many people we do anyway very often. We attune to each other, but often unconsciously. And so, on the one hand, I wanted to write this book because I think we can practice and make that a real skill versus something that's happening often under the radar. And on the other hand, I feel you, and I feel how you feeling me. I believe is the basic building block of relating. It's how our nervous systems are wired to be social. I mean, they are wired to be social for ages, and so when we feel each other, we also have the capacity to first of all notice much more information that is in the space that sometimes when we are hypnotized by the content of our words and intellects, then a lot of the information that's in the room is not being noticed. So I think it deepens the way we experience life. It deepens intimacy, closeness. And I think it also deepens the capacity to hold space when someone in an intimate relationship, in a community, in the world is in distress, and we attune to that distress in a way that helps the person to slowly come down, digest whatever is difficult, and integrate it. And I think if you want to create ecosystems, because you mentioned a quote, I think we are all not only individuals, we are individuals and ecosystems at the same time. And I think I use this also in the title, Interdependence. We're all interdependent. And so that's why I thought, after seeing so much trauma and collective trauma in the world, and seeing how positive relationships and real listening and not just giving advice, but really being interested helps a lot. So that's why I tuned needed to be the next book.
I appreciate that example. And inadvertently, I think even, and I don't know what you would say to this, but I think even me noticing, right, the chills on my body is an example, right, of the visceral or the somatic, the body-based kind of state of some degree of attunement, right? There was some aspect of my being that liked or was in alignment with that quote. And I'm even getting them now with your explanation. And I'm saying that to say, of course, and I've come from historically, or I was trained as a clinical psychologist, and for very many years I had a private practice where, while I would I always thought of myself as integrative, and I met the practice of mindfulness, though it was very much just a concept in my world. It was not necessarily something I was able to practice. And we're going to go into this in terms of trauma and the nervous system, the collective nervous system in a bit, though. Sharing that to say, for a very long time, many years, my body was unable to really kind of be attuned. I wasn't working with my clients more so, even acknowledging their physical bodies or their degree of attunement or lack thereof based on their own trauma. So for me, I saw it as really a shortcoming in my own inability to heal, to navigate some of my intergenerational trauma passed within my own family. And I very much saw it as a limitation in terms of the field and the way that I was then working with my clients. So I love how so much of your work is, highlighting that, I've shifted now into working holistically and having a community-based approach. So there's just so much alignment in terms of the work that you do, really based in, again, these concepts. So you've already said something that I want to ask you to dive a bit deeper into now. I think I heard you bring up the concept of the collective nervous system. So can we talk a little bit for listeners who might not have heard that concept, or, I was obviously describing an individual nervous system, but what do you mean when you say collective nervous system?
Yeah, anatomically, when we see that nervous system, it looks kind of pretty simple and clear cut that it belongs to a body and it's an individual thing. So it's your nervous system, or it's mine, or it's his or hers. But through my work, I've seen, listen, this is not really true. I think that our nervous system encodes for individual experiences and traits and individual gifts and intelligence. But I think our nervous system is naturally ancestral too, and it's collective too. And that the biosphere, because sometimes when you I ask people, so when you go through the forest, where is nature? And some people say, oh, nature is around everywhere. And I say, yeah, but it's around what? And it's around nature. So nature is not just around us, and society is also not just around me. Society is through me. But that makes a big difference. Either we are the planet, or we are walking on the planet. But even the concept of a human being, that my body doesn't feel like it's resting deeply as the planet or in the planet, and it's part of the planet. So we have kind of a dualism, or kind of a separation built into how we view the world, and sometimes how we then think about the world. And many indigenous or other mystical healing traditions learn to dispel or integrate that kind of separation, and notice a much deeper relatedness to everything. It starts with nature, it continues with our humanity, and with a much bigger reality maybe. And so the collective nervous system means that we are also, anyway, always collectively wired. We belong together. We can hurt those connections. It's very painful to hurt relationships. It's very painful to wage wars. And we feel the after effects of over many generations of how it impacts the collective nervous system. But we are all connected underneath anyway. It doesn't matter if we feel it or not. Sometimes we might feel pretty separate, but doesn't mean that we are really separate. And so that collective dimension, when I did the collective trauma work and started 20 plus years ago, I started to notice, oh, wow, like the system is, we are living in a traumatized system, like the water that we are swimming in is traumatized. And we all were wired and conditioned by a traumatized system. And so that's why it's so hard to see sometimes, because it's a part of it is invisible to our senses. And then we say, oh, that's how it is. That's how politicians talk. That's how it works here. That's how it works there. But that's not how it works. That's how it often works in a hurt world. But let's say that, at least that we are hurt, that we can start to look at that and not say that's how it is. And so that's where also the notion of, because the positive effect of the collective nervous system is we can create spaces, and like you create a big community, and that community is a connected nervous system also. And in that community, many people can find healing, growth, development just by being part of a community. And I think that's super powerful. That's, I think, the remedy, and where we are going is this collective healing work.
I love that you kind of touched on our blindness in a sense. I read about, or in school, I remember I had a visual psychology, visual processing class, and we learned about a concept that I was so fascinated by, which was called inattentional blindness, which was the studied, kind of fact that we could, physiologically have something, on in our retina, on our eye, to register seeing whatever object it was, though if our attention was distracted, we actually, become blind to that. And, listeners or people in my community who've heard me talk often heard me use a similar analogy of like the horse with blinders on it. And I love how you're kind of describing it beyond, because I think about even in my own journey in my own family, how it becomes so easy to self-identify, right, by that climate, those habits of relating or disconnecting, whatever it might be, and to assume, right, it's just how we are because everyone around you, we are blind. And, I think then that shifts and changes as we go over to our friend's house and we're introduced to new climates. But really, when that's then mirrored in society, I saw this for myself in my 20s, where I was highly anxious, highly disconnected. I was living in New York City with a lot of frenetic energy. All of my friends were feeling the same way, living for the weekend, exhausted all of the time. So like a blindered person, right? Why would I think that there was any other way to feel in my family, in my relationships, in my 20s? Because that's how everyone was feeling around me. But I want to dig a bit deeper into when you talk about, kind of our own individual experiences of whether it's individual trauma or collective trauma, and, hoping you could just say a little more, a little more specifically of how that does impact, or what is the impact that we see in terms of our nervous system, our collective nervous system, or really simply our ability to attune.
Yeah, let's start with that. Most of the trauma that we deal with is, maybe besides nature catastrophes or whatever. So, but most of the trauma is a result of ill-attuned relational moments, shut down relational moments. Parents don't beat their children up if they feel their children. So we need to be so triggered and enraged and so cut off that we can beat the child, or that we can abuse somebody, or that, there are many. These moments are usually moments that are disrelated, and the disrelatedness of one generation perpetuates itself through these moments to the next generation. And so what happens in the traumatic moment is that there's such an overload. I often say, because many people work on presencing or becoming more present. And it looks like it's kind of a bit of an effort to become more present. But when we look at the traumatic moments, in the traumatic moments, life says, here in space and time, it's not good for me. When somebody gets abused in that moment, or experience violence, like in that moment, here in the body, staying open, staying related, staying present to what is not good. So not being present, the forces of getting out of our body, getting out of our emotions, shutting down something, putting a kind of a permanent anesthesia onto parts of our body and emotions and minds, is the most intelligent thing to do. And I think that's very important for many of us that judge ourselves for the wounds or the trauma and the issues that we have in life. But they are not real issues in the sense that they shouldn't be there. Most of our patterns make perfectly sense given our life story. So reframing not being present can sometimes be something like a kind of a downside to me, or like a weakness, but it's not a weakness. It's an intelligence that helped me to survive something better than without it. And I think once I begin to look at myself that way, that everything, even if I cannot feel my body at the beginning or certain parts of my body, then shutting those down was better than leaving it open. So we can say, I can't feel my body, or we can also say, I managed to shut that part down. If the second version is empowering because it means, oh, first of all, that's not forever. Secondly, there's a process in place that if I don't feel, not feeling is a process. And so if I get to know that process, I can begin to soften that process, because most probably today I'm in a different place, I'm in different circumstances, I don't need that anymore, and I can synchronize my present moment with that past, with that numbing, for example. And I think a similar process is also in place in our society, through racism, through gender violence, through colonialism, through big wars and genocides and dictatorships and power over abuse. Like, we are living in a world where numbing oneself, fragmenting, splitting was needed in order to survive these disasters and or a Holocaust. I mean, how could people not shut down their systems in concentration camps? Of course they had to. And I think if we begin to feel that more in ourselves and in others, not something that just needs to be fixed, but something that needs attention. We need to provide for each other attention, listening, sensing, attunement where we can. Sometimes we have enough space to do this. Sometimes we are triggered ourselves or we are hurt ourselves, so we can't. But in the moments when we can provide that. And I think that's also true collectively. And so that these wounds need attention, not good advice, not fixing, not, oh, we should do it better, not intellectualization, but attention and relationships heal our trauma. And you know best also that there are many studies that say that if you have positive relational experiences in adverse situations, the after effect of the trauma impact will be much lower. So that's something many of us can provide, at least in many moments, maybe not always, but in many moments. And if we do that, we create communities that are much more generous and resilient.
I appreciate that. And this kind of brings in another beautiful quote where you write in terms of our own individual trauma. And then I'm going to ask you to dive a little bit deeper into the collective aspect of it a second. But trauma disrupts the act of relation, fracturing our capacity to relate with self and with others. And just to clarify, because I was really fascinated by the concept of collective absencing. And I think you were mentioning it a bit. Though, again, can you say a little more on kind of how, our own, and what is the connection between this individual fracture and now this kind of, in terms of our societal or our collective nervous system, and this, I'm really fascinated with this concept of absencing. So when you say collective absencing, kind of what is that connection? And can you just share a little more about that concept itself?
Yeah, let's let's start with the absencing you mentioned. Absencing in the fracture of the self and our relational capacities is often that sometimes when we feel ourselves, we feel that we don't feel. Sometimes we don't feel. And then we try to fill that moment with some stuff versus saying, I don't know. And in the moment I can be more with my own absencing or with my numbing, that's not something that I can do, but it's something I need to get to know, because when I get to know my numbing, I can turn slowly numbing into feeling again. But sometimes when we don't feel, we go to look what we might be feeling, and that's already overriding the overwhelm. So we make it just worse than better because it just gets harder. And I think there's a similar, no, there's a similar process in the collective dimension, that often collective trauma means that many people of a society went through a similar trauma. Let's say the Second World War, the Civil War, racism in the US, or colonialism in other places. That there was a very big impact on a part of the population that many people experience traumatic events at the same time. So it's not only because, let's say there's a bike accident. So there's one person traumatized, but then there is an environment in the city that actually is a holding space. So the collective space doesn't go through the same trauma than the one person. So there's a stable collective and there's an individual hurt. When you have massive impacts of trauma, you have many hurt individuals, but the holding space is diminished. So the collective holding capacity is also very fragmented or chaotic. Let's say bombs raining down on, like I was born in Vienna, like my grandparents experienced how Vienna was bombed in the Second World War. Of course, like there are hundreds of thousands of people affected at the same time, sitting in bomb shelters and some houses being destroyed. So this is the collective field becomes very fragmented. So that has, and I believe that creates immediately like a collective trauma response, or like a tribal, and today it's much bigger, but trauma response. And that gets stored in our collective psyche. So shutting down a part of our experience in order to survive these moments is intelligent. But if we don't take care of it, and often there was no knowledge, there was no possibility, people needed to survive, they didn't have anything to eat, like there is no way that trauma healing and hanging out in a retreat center is the thing that we do. So it didn't get taken care of, and it get passed on to us, and we needed to deal with that also because the former generation couldn't heal that. And so collective absencing also means that when we look at society, we might think, oh, I know what's going on in society, I see it on social media, I see it on, I don't know, in the news, but actually, and then we developed a practice. It's called global social witnessing. Then I said, okay, let's check that. So let's see where we are when you get a CNN feed of a school shooting. Check. Now we create the circumstances that we check in. What are you actually experiencing? And for many people, some we read that, but we can't feel what that means. We know what that means intellectually, but we can't feel it emotionally, physically. To tune in, to be attuned to that event is too overwhelming. And that's okay that it is that. But then it sounds like in the information age, we all are so informed. But actually, when you look at inform, it's in and a form. So when you inform me right now means I feel you in me, then I have a form of you in me. Your information informs my nervous system. So I can feel you in my body, I can feel you emotionally, I can feel you, even though we're sitting thousands of miles away, we can feel each other if we want to. And I think that the collective absencing prevents us from really being contemporary witnesses of the things that are going on in our societies. That's why they keep repeating themselves all the time. And I think there's so much trigger that we need to learn to work on that, because if not, then those unfelt areas become the areas where all kinds of social issues start to happen that we try to deal with symptomatically often, versus like really going to the root and healing the societal framework from within, not trying to put a patch on it.
You bring up, and I'm wondering if this kind of is a stepping stone to, you bring up a concept of the relational field, and kind of, can you kind of say a little more, kind of define exactly what that is, what that looks like? And then obviously, if you could wrap that into this idea of, whether it's individual or social presencing, or individual or social absencing, again, based in, for many of us, intergenerational collective trauma passed down, what then impact it could have, or how this translates. Because I think for listeners, and my listeners in particular, the relational field, I'm imagining, and as you're going to explain, is something that we are navigating, right, as individuals and collectively, day in and day out. So kind of giving us kind of the concrete, what it is, and again, how we can see these different levels of impact that you're beautifully describing.
Mm. Yeah, the first thing is like a relation, of course, starts always with me. So if I don't feel my body, I will miss a lot of information that you're sending to me now. When I'm more attuned to my body, it's like a tuning fork. Then my body will naturally resonate with yours and it will give me information and it will be a natural process, not that I'm going for it's just happening. Resonance just happens because it's more fluid. So I think relating is anyway a process of like I feel myself, I feel the space in between us because the space in between us is not just air or maybe internet. The space in between us is full of information. You're in the information that you radiate into the space, that I radiate into the space, how they meet, how open we are, how kind of retracted we are, is all informing that space between us. So the intersubjective space is full of information. And when we learn to feel that space, we can, and especially also like professionals like yourself, if we work with a lot of clients, we need that information because it tells us a lot about the process a person is in. And for example, here's an example. For example, when some people, I believe that emotions are shared spaces. Healthy emotions are shared spaces. So when somebody, let's say, I'm afraid, and you feel that I'm afraid, then your feeling of my emotions make we meet in a shared space. But and if I learned as a child that when I'm scared, I always have parents to go to, they feel me, they're with me, I can integrate that, I can go out into the world, be courageous. So my fear when I'm afraid, I can share my fear with people because I feel safe enough to share my fear. So I'll feel people that support me. I'll create an ecosystem. And when I say I'm scared, I will not retract my relational energy. But for many people, when they're afraid, they need to, you see how immediately the energy folds back inwards and they feel more withdrawn. So that's a sign that it's not only about the emotion of fear, it's the emotion of fear in the given relational space that says a lot about how we grew up. So what happens between us is very important also for emotional healing, because it's not just enough the emotion, it's also the emotion plus the relational space are important, because that also is important how supported we feel, how much we can receive support from others, and how we can integrate those emotions. And then, of course, so it's me, it's the space in between us, and it's also that I feel you when I talk to you. My nervous system is feeling you, how you receive what I say, what's happening in you, how you speak. All that information is part of it. And so I call the wholeness of what I just shared, me, the space in between us and you, I call relational space. And it's and a similar truth is also for let's say my ancestors, because I can do my genealogy of all my ancestors that I know, but I can also feel through my body and feel into the relationships that I can sense or not sense in myself, and use that as a work to open my ancestral information flow and learn about my ancestors from inside. And I think the same is true also for, I have seen this when we did large scale events for collective trauma fields. So I've seen groups that were, and we worked with Holocaust survivors and with Nazi descendants in the same room, like very explosive space, one would think. But with the right relational holding space of hundreds of people or more that are holding that kind of process, it actually becomes an amazing presence. And I somehow believe, given what I've seen in the last 20 years, that that kind of collective presencing space or spaces, that's that's the next step for healing. And we will still do, of course, one-on-one healing work, but even one-on-one healing work in bigger collective spaces is much faster, much deeper, stronger. It's like there is much more power through the collective witnessing. And so I'm very hopeful, even if we look into the world and we say, wow, it's there's so much pain in the world, which is true. but if we come together and we synchronize our collective relational space and we do it well with the right ingredients, I think the healing power that this, and I'm sure you see this also in your community, that through the community, there's a lot of power being generated that actually benefits everybody in the community.
I'm shaking my head so adamantly, getting just off of one of our workshops in the Self Healer Circle. I was ending with gratitude, reflected right back to the other individual members for the container, like you're beautifully describing, that they offer me in my own healing journey, as I'm still very much on it, healing from that misattunement in childhood and all of that absencing, right? That was then, kind of collectively validated in a sense, and everything that I was sharing earlier. So I do want to dive into community and interdependence and even virtual community in just a second, but I'm really fascinated. And it was something that you said earlier, and again, wrote in your book. I'm really fascinated by this line where you say, and you've used the word integrated a couple times, so I just want to poke into that a bit, but you say unintegrated history is past, integrated history is presence. I think that's just so beautiful. And of course, for listeners who have heard now this idea of integration come in, and kind of, I think, what we're talking about individually and collectively, even, utilizing or referencing ancestors and this idea of trauma passed on. And can you say more about the difference between unintegrated history and why you describe that as past versus integrated history and presence? I think that's just so beautiful.
Yeah, like I love it too. Yeah, yeah, that's the same. So the collective healing work, I thought one day, our whole concept of history actually doesn't make sense, because even the whole concept of time that we have, because it's commonly known as yesterday was the past and tomorrow is the future. And then sometimes I say to people, how often did you have tomorrow the same conversation with your spouse that you had already 10 times or 20 times? Many times. So we had it again. So then I say, yeah, but if you have the same loop again tomorrow, how come that tomorrow is the future? Maybe tomorrow is just a repetition of the past. So that doesn't really make sense. And then, but when we integrate something in the trauma healing work, we can see how something that was split off and was othered in myself, like how many people say, I want to get rid of my fear, like as if the fear was something other that I can cut off. And that's exactly the trauma, because I needed to cut off that fear as a 2-year-old. So we repeat, even in our attempt to heal ourselves, the same thing that happened already way earlier in our life. Instead of saying, wow, people wouldn't say, I want to cut off my right arm. And then everybody says, no, of course not. Say, but why, of course not? Why the fear, yes, and the arm not? It doesn't make sense. But the fear is as much you as is your arm, or as part of you. And and so then we see, wow, we are repeating even in the healing work. We want to get rid of our problems more than to integrate them, which means to learn to feel that fear, bring it back home, integrate it, and make it part of our growth. So to take information that has been split off and reintegrate it into the central flow. And so when we say integrated history, every time something heals, it feels more integrated and present. So all the stuff from our ancestors that is integrated is just part of our presence here. All your ancestors, all my ancestors, when the integrated part is having this conversation. But the unintegrated history, the history that needed to split off, that often lives in us as massive individual and collective fears, massive rage, massive absencing, as we talked about, fragmentation, othering, that reproduces itself again and again as circular patterns. And so that's why I said, yeah, it doesn't make, we cannot say the history is the past. That doesn't make sense. So integrated history is presence. It's alive in us. It creates our perspective right now, because I didn't invent the heart, but the heart is pumping in my chest. But I couldn't say that I did that. Millions of years did that. through our ancestors. And so many other things, even so many things we say today, somebody already said once somewhere. So they are not so original. Sometimes we play like, wow, everything we develop, but it's not that original. You know, there were great people around over a long period of time. And but unintegrated history produces those patterns that we are afraid in situations where we actually there is no threat and we are still afraid, or we are numb and there is no overwhelm, but we feel numb because we were overwhelmed in the past. That's unintegrated history, and that's the past, or in a Far East language, that's the karma that has been passed on, postponed experience. And so whatever we cannot integrate, we pass on to the next generation. And our ancestors did the same. So we are sitting in a way in the postponed experience of former generations. And that's why I often say it's our job as humanity to clean up the living room. I think we need to clean up our collective living room in order to really be present with each other. We can't just innovate more and then try to be free of the past. Just let's forget it. No, it won't forget us. That's that's the problem. Yeah, we might forget the past, but it won't forget us. So it will come back as the ghosts and the demons and the fears and the shame that will again have an effect on our current day relationships.
I appreciate that very beautiful description. And what I've really always appreciated about your work, Thomas, is your ability to honor even that which you can't see, won't see, right, aren't equipped to see individually and collectively. Because I do think in the kind of prolific amount of information that we now have available, and I hear this often within the community, I do think a lot of us have this belief, sometimes for well-intentioned survival-based purposes, right? I'm past there, right? Those generations didn't affect me. And we kind of turn our own then blind eye, yet we have a mismatch between what our body is saying differently in those moments, though we're trying to almost will ourselves, sometimes reading information of, just affirm different and look toward and, spiritual, emotional bypassing and this idea. And your work has always really honored not only the individual pain that inevitably we're going to carry as humans. So the pain that for many of us that I think is even more confusing pain that has been passed on throughout in our ancestors. And for me, it was the biggest shift was beginning to view not only my child, but my childhood, but all of my ancestors as a impact on what experiences that I had. Because for a very long time, I had this narrative that, I had this very close, connected, happy family, nothing was wrong. I had a roof over my head. I had a, physically present caregiver at all times, though I did not realize that in terms of absencing, there was a huge hole of emotional absence, again, passed down through my lineage. So for me, it was really a point of confusion, especially being a clinical psychologist who worked with people who had those big terrible things, that you even described earlier that had happened. And yet I was finding myself struggling in the same ways, feeling disconnected in the same ways, dealing with the disconnection in all of the habitual same ways. And without this language to understand that I actually too was carrying this deep rooted suffering that was almost indefinable until I began to have the language. And of course, your work was one of the biggest impacts in terms of being able to have the language to open up the blinders a bit and say, well, wait a minute. There were a lot of things, that did not happen, and ways in which, individuals coming from two older parents, I did not even have the opportunity to meet even my grandparents' generation, let alone great grandparents. And there's a lot of lack of recall in my family, again, based in their own traumatic childhood. So there's no even passed down stories of how things were. So again, with that blankness, I didn't have the understanding that my body still was carrying the memories. And for me, even you touching on this kind of idea of collective fear, for me, individual fear manifested in panic disorder in those 20s that I was describing earlier. And, only having the language of, oh, well, my family's kind of nervous and there's health stuff happening. So of course I am too, but not understanding the depth beneath that iceberg. So I do want to make a shift back to, like I offered earlier, into interdependence. We talked about, or you brought up that concept itself, and we've been talking about it in terms of absencing and presencing in general. But I am hoping you can say a bit more. And I just have, as always, on one more beautiful quote. The architect of true human connection somehow includes yet transcends the personal. Interdependence is at once deeply intimate and utterly universal. Pure moments of relating reach us at the root, touching who we truly are, while simultaneously elevating what is possible for us to become. So I'm sure many listeners have heard this concept of interdependence being used. Can you say a little more about what interdependence is, and particularly you describe it as deeply intimate and utterly universal? So in a sense, we are all joined in this concept, in
Mm,
this practice.
mm. It's lovely how you read the parts. It's lovely how you give it your energy and how it touches you, and then it brings this quality into the space. It's very beautiful. Um, yeah, interdependence. I think that's also like me responding to how I feel you feel this sentence is already part of interdependence. That you affect me, it touches me, and then I respond to how it touches me means we are sharing something. We are meeting through the quote in the emotional depth that we are both interested in this kind of things and in exploring life. It creates a mutual space. And I think that's part of interdependence. That, by the way, we are also breathing the air that keeps us alive right now, and we are part of a biosphere that provides the air that we can have this conversation, means that we are interdependent in that way. And it also means that when I am as a, because we are living in this hyper individualized Western world, but it's not only Western anymore, but this hyper individualism creates the illusion as if there is a separate individual that can do anything, reign like kind of be the king of the world, and at the same time can have everything in the world that he can get, and is responsible for his own success and failure. Then of course I'm also responsible for my way and my path, but that's not the only thing that there is. And I'm not just an individual, I'm always ecosystemically active, which I think also results in what I wrote in the book, that I think, like, sometimes people say, oh, it's my unconscious. Yeah, of course, it's also my unconsciousness, but I need a community to share my unconsciousness for my unconscious to stay in place. Because if I have many awake people around me, I will feel a lot of developmental stress because all this stuff will come up, because people will see and feel what I can see and feel. So that will create some movement in me. So there is not something merely individual. We are always affecting each other all the time. And that's, I think, also the great benefit, because it means whatever we go through as societies, look at COVID, how much COVID was a fragmentation and polarization. But at the same time, we could have solved COVID as one society, going for one and integrating the different views in a different way. It doesn't mean that we all need to agree, but it means that the relationships are stronger than the disagreement. And that's not what happened. Often the disagreements were stronger than the relationships. And then the whole thing fragments, and then we have the different them and us and the ones we fight. And I think that shows us where the collective trauma of the past has a lot of influence. But interdependence means how I live my life. When people say, "Oh," I mean, there are some interesting things in the self-development scene. One is like the notion, like, okay, how developed we are. But how developed we are, we see when we look at our life, because what you're able to manifest around you, that's your state of consciousness. How your relationships look like, how your family life looks like, how your work life looks like. Let's look at that. That gives us a clear a reflection of what we need to work on and what already is flowing, and where we are open, generous, tight, and all this. And all of that's okay, but it's like life gives us anyway all the time amazing feedback. We just need to listen to it. And the other thing that fits a bit to what you said, you mentioned something first, was really beautiful about the spiritual bypassing. because sometimes we don't even notice that we are doing this, because how many people say, how long do I have to do this work still? How long do I need to work on myself? When will I be there? And I say, where? And there. And then there is an idea of it there. And then we don't see that the there is the reflection of what's not here. The part that couldn't be here because it was too painful always needs it there to give it hope that it can continue working, but it's a sign that I'm not here. And the whole question about how long do I need to do the work says only something about that some aspects are hard for me to feel and discover. But let's call it that way, but that's okay. It's okay that it's hard to discover, but let's call it that way. Let's not get hypnotized by where we are going. And I think interdependence also is a feeling that we are part of, even if sometimes we don't feel that way, because sometimes we feel very isolated, lonely, depressed, and that also belongs to it. But we are always affecting the ecosystem, and if we put poison into the ecosystem, we will breathe poison. And if we bring clean air into the ecosystem, we will breathe clean air, because we will breathe it together. And I think that's why I love interdependence. And it's also that I think I often say love is precision, or precision is love. That love is universal, but at the same time, it's very specific, and it means exactly the person in that state of development, in that process that's going on for him or her or them. That's what needs to be seen now. So that there is no, either it's universal or it's both all the time. It's very specific, and it's also very open and spacious and wide and universal.
That's so beautiful. I'm again really appreciating again how you're, kind of honoring the reality that we are always connected to someone, to something at all times, even because one of the things that I do hear often, right, is this idea of, hyper independence. And even when I speak about, a lot in my work, I talk about this idea of self-healing in community, right? This idea of exactly the conversation we're having, in a lot of ways of becoming aware of all that we're, carrying into and creating through a more community-based model, shifting from the old way I used to work after coming to this realization and the impact of relationships in my own journey. One of the criticisms I often hear is this belief misinterpretation that what I'm suggesting is anywhere a version of a hyper independence focus on self. So I appreciate you kind of acknowledging that that is actually physiologically impossible in terms of the natural being and the embeddedness that we each, are and offer. And I was also laughing when you were describing about getting there. My language for that, and I talk about this often within the community, is my preference was to be done, to be completed, right, to check off that final box of achievement that I was endlessly searching for, because that's the only way I knew how to define myself, in absence of an emotional connection, right? So all of the shame of who I was in my entirety was shoved down in a self-focus on this identity of achieving, and thinking that that would then give me not only peace, but a connected, fulfilling, deep emotional relationship, which I was proclaiming from the rafters that I desperately wanted, yet was continuing through my own absence in my own relationship with myself, and absence in my actual relationships with other people, that I was continuing, of course, to perpetuate those cycles. So I am going to self-profess I was endlessly in search of done. I call it my hippie hammock in the sky, where I could throw my peace signs and live a fulfilling life, only to realize that I had to be an active participant. And as we're kind of diving just a bit deeper, before I let you go into this idea of interdependence, as we touched on a bit, community, and the value and the importance, as I'm hearing you reflect back my own agreement, the importance of healing in community. So I'm hoping you can speak a little bit about not only the process of getting in touch with our own ancestral wounds, trauma, and how that plays out in our relationships, though what you really do see and hope for the future in terms of a more communal way of healing and of navigating and of healing, again bringing the concept very much full circle, our collective nervous system, and what is
Mm.
kind of the role and the process of both, again, our own ancestral wounds and connecting globally, or however it is in a more community interdependent way.
Mm. Yeah, I started like 5 years ago. I said, okay, we need to get the word out about collective trauma. So I started a collective trauma summit. I think the fifth is coming up soon now. And 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 it really worked. It like collective trauma became more of a buzzword. And I often say, if you want to start a movement, gather your tribe. Connect to the people that go into a similar direction, have resonances, and you create networks. And if you create networks, you create a buzz, and you strengthen each other. So and that really worked. And during that work, I often said, I think we need, like, hospitals seem so normal, when in fact there was a time when hospitals didn't exist. So how come that there were no hospitals and then now there are hospitals? Is somebody thought, or some people thought, it would be great for sick people to have a place to find help. Okay, however that happened and however long it took, and I think we need the same. We need a collective healing architecture that every nation, I think, needs to begin to take responsibility for the legacy that has been passed on through multiple or one generation, whatever, or has been created in this generation, like a war in our lifetime. And uh, and I think we have to learn to take more ownership, and this needs education. This needs to get the word out. This needs systems to start embracing collective trauma. But we need an architecture to heal those legacies. This intergenerational work that you mentioned, that you also did and you find powerful, I think it needs to be a public health activity. And we need public hospital, like hospitals for the collective health. And those are places also, like you're creating a community. Like we need to create bigger communities where we can do that safely, where we can do that with each other, where we have some guidance how to do it, and then heal the legacies. And because I also often say it's not only about the trauma. I mean, the trauma is like, imagine there is a book, and in the book is the remedy how to restore something, but the book is frozen in ice, so you can't read it really, so you can't create the magic potion. So you need to de-ice the book. A lot of the trauma work is de-icing our life, making our life more fluid, more relational, more connected. But what does that lead to? That leads to the fact that we begin to feel, not only know, begin to feel what actually was the ethical transgression that led to the traumatization in the first place. Because as long as we can't feel it, we can't restore it. So, but the ethical transgression is stored in the ice, in the permafrost. So we need to de-ice that permafrost, not only to heal our bodies, but I think when the ethical development can be harvested and we experience post-traumatic learning, we literally upgrade the ethical understanding of our world. And I think if you deal with AI, if you deal with nanotechnology, if you deal with genetic engineering, if you deal with, I don't know, all kinds of weapons, we have to have a sound ethical wisdom. But some of our wisdom as humanity is frozen in the ice that we didn't heal yet. So that's why we can think a lot of ethical thoughts, but in many moments when that really counts, we don't act like that. And that's an issue. We don't walk our talk all the time, because some of the past is still frozen in the ice that we've never melted, so we never got the ethical learning. And I believe that the ethical learning is more than its ethics or its ways of how we the law is embedded in relationships. The Tao Te Ching has a beautiful sentence in the translation of Stephen Mitchell. It says, when everybody follows the Tao, the law will be written in their hearts. I think that's so beautiful. It's like the law is not an external rule book. The law is embedded in my action, in my words, and in the way how we relate to each other. The law is in it, not externalized. But when it's externalized, it means that we are also externalized in ourselves. We don't feel ourselves fully. Otherwise, we wouldn't do certain things. So coming back to that ethical restoration, I think also when the ethical restoration happens, the self-healing mechanism of the biosphere is coming fully back online. And I think then we also live in communities where we can live together in peace and in prosperity, because we live in with the law of life is being written in our hearts. Nobody needs to remind us how to be with our children, how to be with the neighbor, how to be with the other country. Once we need to get that reminder, we already need to stop and look what's happening. So I think that's maybe this collective architecture that every nation has some legacy. And I think we need to begin to do that globally in order. I think it's also needed in order to deal with climate change and big topics like that.
I'm again shaking my head profusely and in just so much resonance with everything that you're sharing, Thomas. And I actually each morning I have a translation of the Tao book and I read 2 pages in it. And I have been known to say that I am of the true belief, and I will go on record saying this, that I truly believe that humans again are compassionate, connective creatures. And I could not agree more that when we're connected with our heart, with the Tao, with law inside of us, that we're not actually out to harm or to hurt or to destruct another person, ourselves, society in general. That, I am of the agreement that I do believe we can, learn how to self-govern, and we are, intrinsically, and even so much of my book, How to Be the Love You Seek, is based on that idea that returning to the heart and to our pure state of compassionate connection, which again, some of us are very much disconnected from, is the way we heal. And before we end, for a selfish reason, I want to kind of just ask you a bit more in terms of building, I heard you say, right, the safe container for collective attunement. And if there are, practical parameters or suggestions, or how you would describe, and whether or not you think it can be done virtually, what it is that would be important for the safety of a community to begin. Because I'm imagining many people listening are going to be inspired, and are on different stages of their journey, and many wanting to create and share themselves and create their own individual communities. So when we're thinking about, right, these shared containers of presencing and of healing our nervous system, are there any, I guess, tips or suggestions, or what you feel to be important, and again, how possible you do feel it to be done virtually as opposed to in person?
Yeah, I think the basic the basic aspect is the intention. Like, why are we doing this? We are doing this in order to come together to heal ourselves. So if that's the premises, if we come together to heal ourselves and be part of other people's healing, then there are already a few things that come into being naturally. One is it needs to be a safe space that is not based on judgment, but that is based on listening, that is based on me not knowing more than knowing, that is not based on giving good advice, but it's based on asking questions that we are interested in, to inquire deeper and support somebody to give birth to their own truth, versus me coming with my truth about you. And it's based on attunement, because co-regulation and attunement creates safety in the nervous system. So when we feel each other, neuroception is a process in the nervous system. Feeling felt creates safety. So when we come together and we want to look at the big topics of our society, we need to create first the relational spaces that are good holding containers with the right ingredients. And then we begin to look deeper, and we start with ourselves, obviously, and we also begin to hold space for others. And I have seen, if we practice that and we keep to certain of the precepts, there are moments in those communities where we looked at some of the deepest pain that people can experience, but like you could hear a pin drop, and like everybody, like hundreds of huge halls were absolutely quiet, and were there. They were quiet because they were so in that nobody thought really, okay, how long it's going to take, because in a state of presence you don't ask how long it's going to take. You're there, and it's amazing, like the power that has, that witnessing is a holding space that can hold very deep pain, intergenerational pain. And of course, that's not something that without any experience we can immediately establish, but I'm just sharing that I have experienced collective healing moments that are amazing. And even if we create lighter versions where we come together, we make a space, we open a space that people feel safe enough to share, we create the right architecture within a bigger group maybe that feels safer at the beginning. So we make sure that not being able to is not a dysfunction, is a need for something else. So if somebody doesn't dare to speak, so most probably there's a reason, and we don't want to override that reason, say, come on, do it. No, but we want to be mindful of that people bring inner states with them that are different than our own experience. I think that's important. So the not knowing more than the knowing is important. And I think the same is true for collective spaces, but it needs some more training, that when we are together collectively virtually, then we really need to practice attunement with each other. So like say you have a big Zoom class where you can see up to 1,000 people, that we practice attunement virtually, that we feel each other, because otherwise our mind tells me, oh, you're thousands of miles away, how can I feel you? But I give sessions to people online in their finest detail of their childhood, and we can feel each other very deeply. And we are sitting and looking at the 2D image, and the person feels the impact on the other side. So there's more than just the distance that connects us here. And I think if we can let go of that mental idea that energy or sensing is local, it's much more than local, then we can really bring a whole community, a global community, into a very intimate space online. And I've seen many of those, and they become very, very intimate. And so I think if we can keep, and we have some skilled, maybe therapists or trained people on board that can hold sometimes the space for more complex trauma. This I think we need also some trained people. So then many things are possible, and then we can choose to which level of depth spaces can go and what is too much. And I think if we know what we can handle and what we cannot handle, then I think it becomes a responsible space. And and I also think that it's the emergence of this time is collective healing spaces. They want to emerge through us. So this is the time.
Could not agree more. And that description was so beautiful. And just again, bringing up within community, we talk a lot about concepts and tools and the circle and things to do to embody lots of what we're talking about here today. Though I've never witnessed such profound healing when that's not necessarily being talked about, and where someone's journey, someone's suffering is what's being shared, because there's the moment of then in the chat itself, hearing someone from quite literally around the world saying, I'm crying here because what you're sharing, right, has resonated. I've attuned to your experience, which could be different in some way, though, emotionally, right? I've touched my own grief, I've touched my own anger, I've touched my own loss or sadness, or whatever it might be. And aside from the good ideas and concepts that I like to think that we share and talk about in practical tools, right? That, to speak to your point so beautifully, is where this, I think, collective, safety and attunement, and when we see ourselves and feel ourselves being seen, that is, I could not agree more. And I'm, again, having met your work now quite some time ago, and continuing to see the impact that you're having in my community and many other communities that are now, popping up. I too am really hopeful for the continued evolution, not only of the psychology field, if you will, but just of humanity itself, really moving toward a more communal, collective, curious, in terms of our unique differences and similarities, and really everything in between. So thank you, thank you for the impact that you're having. And as we're getting ready to end here, where can any listeners, if they're not yet familiar with you or your work, follow along? Obviously, we can make sure everything too is in the show notes for this episode. Where can they pick up your book, Attuned, if they are interested?
Yeah, tuned in the bookstores and at Amazon. On Amazon, you can find it. And you can find it also on attunedbook.com. My website is Thomas Hübl, Huebl, Thomas, Huebl.com. It's the website. And our upcoming summit for everybody who wants to listen to a variety of great speakers and people from different disciplines and cultures and backgrounds. So it's the collectivetraumasummit.com, collectivetraumasummit.com. And maybe the last one is we have an NGO that does collective trauma work, and it's the pocketproject.org, pocketproject.org.
Awesome.
So that's maybe, yeah.
Thank you. And again, we'll make sure all that is linked up below for anyone who is interested in any of those amazing resources. Obviously, I had the opportunity to read your book. It is yet another greatly impactful book, not only on my own individual journey within my community, and I do believe it will really impact everyone who does choose to pick it up. And thank you again for your impact, your mind, the work that you two, are doing as a human and within the collective. And it has greatly impacted me. And as I always like to thank everyone for listening, who tunes into these conversations and is on this journey. I too am of the belief that this is how we heal. Our collective needs healing, and many of us are aware and are doing our individual and our communal parts in doing that. So again, like I shared within my community earlier, I will share with all of you tuning into this channel. It is the role that we are each playing that allows me to continue on my own journey and us to continue to evolve and to heal the collective. So thank you all again.
Thank you. It's beautiful. Just want to also say that the way you hold the space is really beautiful. Like I felt it a very grounded and very beautiful back and forth flow of information, and I felt us very connected. So I deeply enjoyed the space that you create when you do these conversations. It's very beautiful. Thank you.
That really, Thomas, means more to me than you know. As Furkan knows, who's been with me here in the beginning, I've had worked through a lot of my own anxiety, being seen, being connected to, being on camera, putting myself out there authentically, not only with another individual that I was talking to, but knowing that such a big community of the collective would view it. And that was very much evidenced in my presentation. I had a lot of high anxiety. I spoke very fast. I had all this frenetic energy that I too myself have seen move toward a much more grounded presence. So you've affirmed so much of my own individual evolution, and I'm so grateful to hear that you've experienced me in that new way as I continue, like I said, on my own journey of evolution and back to my own heart. So thank you again for sharing that insight, that awareness, that experience of me, and everything you've gifted us all.